Excellent. So people are just joining over the next 15 minutes, and we're going to keep the session running in that way. And at about 1:45, I will lock the session, but hopefully we can get everybody in. We're overwhelmed with the response to this session. We have 98 tickets have been taken up, which is really an enormous number. So we're hoping that the technology works okay. So just to recap for people who are just joining, my name is Matt Sillers and I'm one of the organisers of FLOW Photofest. And it's a great privilege tonight to have Rebecca Marr presenting on Orkney Photographica. Rebecca is going to be giving us a PowerPoint presentation, which will, hope someone's wanting to join, to highlight the range of photographers who've come in to Orkney and photographed Orkney over the years. The chat box will be a good place for people to put questions in. Unfortunately, with the numbers that we have, keeping microphones open just simply I don't think is an option. So therefore, if you have a question, feel free to pop it into the chat box. My role will be to gather questions together and give Rebecca an opportunity to respond at the end. The session is being recorded and will be available on the FLOW Photofest YouTube channel at a later date once everything has been edited and sorted out. So I'd like to introduce Rebecca. Rebecca Marr is a photographic artist rather, living in Orkney. She was born in the Highlands, growing up at Lentron near Inverness. And Rebecca first became interested in photography while at school, encouraged by her teacher, Gordon Corrins, who was the brother of the Scottish photographer Douglas Corrins. She set up her first darkroom at home when she was 14, and her mother has never forgiven her for the stains on the carpet. And Rebecca's mother is here tonight, so with a good, there's opportunity to pop something in the chat box. There we are. Rebecca studied media studies, first of all, with Gail Chrisman at Inverness College. And Gail Chrisman is one of the Highland icons. Gail was responsible for bringing many people into the media and the creative industries. And Rebecca was one of her students in the 1980s. Moving from Inverness College, she studied photography at Napier in 1989 under Robin Gillanders. Since then, she's worked as a community artist, a commercial photographer, and more recently as a museum photographer working with photographic archives. 2007 was a pivotal year when she took up an artist residency with the Piers Arts Centre in Orkney. Sorry, I'm just admitting someone. The project Art and Agriculture was a year-long full-time residency embedded in the farming community. Rebecca and her husband, filmmaker Mark Jenkins, decided to make Orkney their home a few weeks after she started that residency. Rebecca is now a visiting tutor on the University of the Highlands and Islands BA Honours in Fine Art and MA in Art and Archaeology courses. She regularly collaborates with other artists and with authors and has a creative heritage and arts partnership with her husband called Collecto. Currently, she's working on a year-long collaboration with the poet Valerie Gillis, which is looking at wild grasses of Scotland. Rebecca will not be presenting her own work tonight, but will be sharing with us some of the wealth of photographers who are from Orkney, have made it their home, or have travelled to make work there. So Rebecca, I'd like to hand over to you. I'll just stop sharing the welcome slide and allow you the opportunity to pop up your own presentation. And I'll have a quick look at the chat box and see how we're doing. Oh, my mouse has gone to sleep. There we are.
Thank you, Matt. And I will just share my screen with everyone. And we'll do it like that. Okay. Okay, Matt, can you see that all right?
Yes, that's working absolutely perfect. It's just changed slide quickly there. I don't know if you wanted to be
that's
in your
okay.
original slide.
I just moved that on to do that. So that's
yes,
fine.
All coming through loud and clear.
That's great. Okay, so welcome everybody, and thank you for joining this FLOW evening tonight. It's lovely to be part of the festival and lovely to have Orkney as part of the festival this year as well. So what I'm going to do just now is just take you through a little bit about Orkney and Orkney's photographic heritage, fitting in with the legacy theme of the festival. So this talk is not photographic history, although we may touch on photographic technologies, nor is it a history of Orkney through photographs, though indeed many of these images undoubtedly witness and document social history in Orkney. Rather, this will be a presentation of photographs that are in themselves fascinating photographs, ones that make the most of the photographic medium, exploiting the tension between the supposed true representation made by a machine and the overriding will of the artist to use the camera as a creative tool for expression. This talk is a personal selection of photographs made by photographers from Orkney and visiting photographers. And I must, before I start, note some glaring omissions in the presentation, such as Sharon Crossley, Alistair Peebles, Richard Welsby, George Ellison, George Washington Wilson, Valentine, and indeed Anonymous, being among the ones that are omitted tonight. But perhaps at a future date, there will be an opportunity for a more conclusive study of Orkney and photography. So I'd like to start tonight with a scrap of paper that was found in the photographs in the papers of the photographer Gunnie Moberg. And I was fortunate enough to work with Gunnie Moberg's archive a number of years ago. It is in fact a useful translation or a misremembrance of a Paul Klee quote. And I think it is a useful thought applied to photography, the medium that in the artist's hands is not a passive recorder, but one that is imbued with agency. It can produce an effect, make a change in how we see something, make it visible. Now we'll return to Gunnie Moberg later. This talk is laid out using the chronology of photographers. And so I've used their birth dates to determine where they fall in our timeline of Orkney Photographica. So is this one of the earliest portraits of an Orcadian by an Orcadian? This man here is Thomas Firth, and he worked for the Hudson Bay Company. And here he is in his moose hide jacket with its intricate beadwork, likely made by his First Nation wife in Canada. This photograph could be very early, mid-1860s. We don't have a date for it, but as Thomas Firth died in 1867, it gives us an indication of the time of the photograph. And just to give you some context, photography was invented in 1839. So here we have a confident photographer behind the camera here, operating a portrait studio in Orkney, only a couple of decades after the invention of the medium itself. So it was William Hugh Wood who made that fascinating portrait. And Wood's collection of 1,000 glass plates is held at Orkney Library and Archive. He was born in Rendell and he worked in Finstown as the postmaster there. This photograph of William Wood's tells us something of the difficulty of creating a lively scene in a medium which at this early time in photography required stillness. The attempt to make an action shot of inaction is painfully observed here in the gentleman with the stairs. You can feel his eyes watering, determined not to blink for the duration of the exposure. And you can just perceive the double image of the pipe stem of his companion next to him, who must have made a twitch. Actually, can I just say that that man bears a passing resemblance to my father, actually. Not the one with the pipe, the other one. So here, Wood creates a more convincing mid-action photograph at a smiddy. We still feel the frozen quality of the sitters, and the long exposure has caused the fire to record itself like a ball of white, almost like a ghost. However, the boy feels very present, and it almost makes us feel that he's just looked up at the height of his hammer swing, having heard us come in the room. And we'll move through different photographers at this sort of pace. So here we have Robert Heddel Robertson, and he was born in South Ronaldsay in 1872 and moved to Stromness as a young man, where he opened 2 grocery shops, prospering from the herring industry boom. He sold photographic equipment and produced prints and postcards. He moved to Westray after the herring trade moved on to Stronsay. This photograph is titled Tinker Family at North End Strong. And the rich detail of the travelling family life as recorded is a strong element of the composition above, made from an upturned boat of the stone building behind it. David Horne was born in 1877, and his father ran a bacon curing business in Kirkwall, which David took over and became known as Porky Horne. Here he beautifully positions the Market Cross from a low viewpoint to record its shape against the featureless sky. The Market Cross signifies a place where merchants would gather to trade or town criers to give a message, but here the bustle and noise has gone, and Horne photographs it here almost like a relic in silence, with only one soul on the street. Although Horne saw himself as an amateur photographer, he had really good camera equipment and compositional control. It is recorded that some of these band members were also called Horne. And in case you're wondering what the instrument is, that's a Stroh violin, which has two horns, a large one to project the sound and a small one to allow the musician to hear the output, and possibly hear a third horn if this man is related to the photographer. I really enjoy this particular composition and its use of the window as a device. And you can see the pressure of the younger boy's knee pressed against the glass, and the awkwardness of the young men as they self-consciously freeze a moment that they have done 100 times before but never really thought of. A moment that of course now exists forever in a photograph that says, "This is how your hand looked when you held the cloth." Tom Kent is one of Orkney's most well-known photographers, it would be true to say, and he was born on the island of Ed in 1863, and he moved with his family to the parish of Firth. And it was after emigrating to America and becoming a student of the renowned Chicago photographer M.J. Steffens that Kent learnt the skills that allowed him to set up shop on his return to Orkney. He used the most sophisticated equipment available at the time, but that would still mean having to carry around a large, heavy wooden camera and a quantity of glass plates, no mean feat. Orkney Museum now displays some of his camera equipment and his other ephemera around Tom Kent, including his Monitor Rochester plate camera and tripod that you see here. The quality of Tom Kent's photographs was recognised outside Orkney, and he contributed regularly to professional magazines as well as pictorial publications such as Country Life. This photograph of a Shell oil lamp known as a buckie was published in Country Life in 1924. Kent was photographing Orkney at a time of change, but largely what he was photographing was things that had not changed. He was seeking an Orkney that was slipping from view, an Orkney that would fit the narrative of the magazines of an unaltered far north and idyll. Sadly, Tom Kent seems to have fallen on hard times in later life. And when he died in 1936, is almost a no bookseller, despite his legacy of over 6,000 mostly glass plates, some of which have given us the iconic images of Orkney at the beginning of the 20th century. Indeed, Kent's glass plates established the Orkney Photographic Archive in 1976, which coincidentally is the year that photographer Gunnie Moberg came to Orkney, and her archive would later join Tom Kent's. Two photographers almost a century apart, who together have created some of the most beautifully composed images of Orkney. As with many of Tom Kent's images, this one taken in Flotta was used as a postcard by the postcard company, the photography company Valentine's. This photograph, taken around 1930, celebrates the dig at Scarabre by Professor Gordon Childe, and all eyes are on the professor as we move through this carefully constructed portrait. And maybe you could take a moment to consider how your eye is moving through this composition and think about what route your eye is taking through it. For myself, I'm led up the pole to this group of men, over here to these gentlemen, here to the ladies, and then down to Professor Gordon Child. So it'd be interesting to know if you had the same sort of route. And this is what you need to do to win first prize for stack building in 1929. And these marvelous stacks topped with Simmons are almost sculptures in themselves. And Kent uses the angular shape of the stackyard wall, almost makes the stacks move forward and smash through the already crumbling wall. Again, here, Kent treats this building, photograph of a building, almost like a portrait. And here, damage has made its impact on this plate of an interior of a Kirkwall chemist. And the waveforms in the damaged area almost feel like they're reaching into the cabinet with the sponges, ready to reunite them with the sea. Kent's early photoshopping skills were highly developed. Here he has exchanged the town lady, seen at the right at the back, for a cutout country woman. And if you look closely at that picture in detail, you can see the cutout of the woman on the left. And also he's populated the some more leaves. This photograph of horses at Savrock St. Ola is a beautiful work, one of my favourite of his. And Kent uses here negative space to generate a mood, the hazy sky, suggesting it was a hot day of work for these horses, having their muscles cooled in the sea. And the composition is in two parts, with nothing, or rather with negative space, occupying the top half of the image, leaving us undistracted and guided to fully enjoy all the movement and shape in the lower half. Here, Kent uses negative space in his portraiture of a man at the blacksmith in Finstown, Geordie Garriott, and here at Papdale, Kirkwall, also using the doorway as a framing device. And here, the doorway draws our attention to the man's backpack, for that is the story here. This is a Frenchman called Charles Milo, and he's in the courtyard here at Tankerness House in Kirkwall, which is now Orkney Museum. And it is 1903, and this man has just arrived in Orkney 2 years into his walking tour of the world. And he is funding this trip through selling postcards of himself. So I like the way he's drawn attention there to the backpack to tell that story. And this is where we will leave Tom Kent tonight, with two of his less well-known images: Pat Cooper's Monkey, 1927, and a £20 tabby. And that's the wonder of archives, the unexpected. And it makes me think of Mike Mandel and Larry Sultan's 1977 book, Evidence, which is well worth checking out. So we come on now to William Hourston. And he was born in Evie and served in both world wars. And the raising of the scuttled ships of the German high seas fleet in Scapa Flow provided Willie Hourston with material for a photographic documentary, and he produced many images of the salvage work over the years. The salvage work provided some prosperity in Orkney in the interwar years, and it's rumoured that the valuable pre-atomic steel from the ships has been used in space travel. And that's not been confirmed or denied by NASA at this point. Now there's 7 ships that remain in the seabed, and they still provide an economy for Orkney, with divers coming from all over to visit the wrecks. Hourston had trained as a joiner and was able to make a lot of his own darkroom equipment. His darkroom was a shed, and it's still standing at the south end of Stromness, mounted with antlers. He was also an occasional lighthouse keeper on Salisbury, and like another photographer we were looking at, who was also a lighthouse keeper, Keith Allardyce. some years later. So all these connections. Now we come to the first in this talk of our visiting photographers. Eve Arnold came to Orkney in 1977 to photograph Margaret Thatcher. Gunnie Moberg also photographed Thatcher's visit, and she remarked at the time how Eve was very good with her elbows. Eve Arnold is just one of the many, well, several magnum stable of photographers to come to Orkney. And from the look of her contact sheet, she was photographing some industries in Orkney, and she photographed farmers at the mart. Elliot Erwitt was 85 when he came to Orkney in 2012 for the Macallan Whisky Company to make some photographs for a series for them called The Real Spirit of Scotland. And he was using a Leica camera, and he shot on film in black and white. This is titled Piggy Chippy, Finstown Car Park. And Erwitt said of it, you'll notice in this picture that somebody is levitating in the back. I didn't ask her to jump, and I didn't even notice that she had jumped until I was printing the pictures. And of course, those of you that know Elliot Erwitt's work, you'll know that legs feature very heavily in his canon. Erwitt, better known for his New York street scenes, was drawn to the surreal spectacle of a mock wedding. And for those of you not in Orkney, I should just explain to you that mock weddings are popular charity events where tickets are sold and a full mock wedding is staged with a meal, speeches and a dance, and quite a lot of cross-dressing as well. So we move on to James Wilfred Marr, born in 1922 and no relation. After school, he worked at the Orcadian newspaper until he was called up into the Royal Navy, and later he rejoined the staff of the Orcadian. He was a founding member of the Kirkwall Camera Club, and this scene is likely swimming lessons in the sea. That's how swimming lessons happened before the pool was built. By 57, Wilfie Marr had left the Orcadian to open a photography studio in Albert Street in Kirkwall, and that's the very same street where Tom Kent had his premises. He specialised in wedding photography and portraits while continuing his documentary work. And this wonderful shot here is Stromness Shopping Week fireworks. Now to John Bulmer, another magnum photojournalist. He worked for the Daily Express, and he became known for his colour photography. He was an early user of colour photography in the early 1960s when he worked for the Sunday Times magazine. And he worked for them right up until the 70s when he became a documentary filmmaker. Bulmer came to Orkney in 1964 to work on a story called Britain's Lonely Islands with the travel writer Eric Newby, and he returned in 76 for Geo magazine. Bulmer's style was to drive around until he saw something. Nothing was prearranged. This is titled Woman Outside Walskirk, 1964. And also 64, this is Kirkwall's Harbour Road. Fantastic shot. Great to see the cars as well, isn't it? And an unnamed couple from mainland in 1976. Oops, sorry. This photograph was taken in North Ronaldsay, and John Bulmer's work was exhibited about 10 years ago at the Peer Arts Centre in Stromness. Now back to another Orcadian, Sandy Wylie. Sandy ran the rural cinema in Orkney, and this is a picture of the rural cinema here. And among the interesting facts about Sandy Wylie is that he spoke Esperanto, and he met his wife through Esperanto correspondence. He worked as a technician at Kirkwall Grammar School, and he built his own lenses and was interested in photomicrography. And he was also interested, sorry, this won't go forward now. He was also interested in astronomy photography, but for some reason I can't go forward. I wonder if that's because I went back. Sorry about this. I'm just going to stop share and then there we go. Can you see that, Matt? Are you?
No, you're not sharing now, so we're just seeing all the wee images of people, wee thumbnails of folk. So.
Oh, well, that's nice. You get a wee chance to see everyone. Okay, am I sharing again now?
Not yet. No, I'm afraid not.
Okay, let's just take a minute to do that. Let's go through this again. This should work.
It's saying screen sharing. Yes, we've got it now. Yep, that's fabulous.
Great. Welcome back, everyone. And so we're joining Sandy Wylie here with his astronomy photography. And this is a long exposure of star trails, but really, of course, it's a long exposure of the Earth turning. And I particularly enjoy this photograph by Sandy Wylie, beautifully composed. And he seemed to have an acute sense of the surreal. And I wasn't aware of Wylie's photographs until David Mackey, then the senior archivist at Orkney Library and Archive, alerted me to them. So another visiting photographer, Fay Godwin. Fay Godwin first visited Orkney in 1978 when she made photographs of the Ring of Brodgar and the Standing Stones of Stennis, photographing a single stone here rather than the entire ring of stones. Godwin has given this stone a particular status, and it almost appears like itself has become a person surveying its territory with its head tilted and arm by its side. Godwin visited twice again in the 90s to take photographs of coastal areas for her body of work, The Edge of the Land. Fay Godwin was born in Berlin in 1931, and her father was a British diplomat and her mother an American artist. She was self-taught, becoming interested in photography in the mid-1960s, photographing her children. Fay Godwin was a friend of Gunnie Moberg, who we'll look at next. And Godwin enlightened Gunnie with the thought that her creation of the garden at her home at dawn was not a turning away from photography as Moberg wanted to do at the time, but rather that it was going to be the creation of a place for her to photograph. The two photographers shared a desire to document the land and witness the landmarks of people on the place. So on to Moberg. Gunnie Moberg was born in Sweden, coming to live in Orkney with Tam and her 4 boys in 1976. And within 3 years, Gunnie had produced one of the most significant, I believe, books of Orkney photographs called Stone Built, just 3 years after arriving. In it, she used her eye as an outsider to make things visible, if you remember back to that quote of hers at the beginning of the talk. And her tools were a camera and a plane. Gunnie was drawn to abstracted images, simple lines. She talked about a photograph's success in terms of its simplicity. She liked how aerial photography knocked out a dimension. Her arrival in Orkney coincided with the cultural flourishing in the Isles, with the establishing of the St Magnus Festival and the Pier Art Centre, among other social and political happenings. Moberg photographed her friends, including writer George Brown and composer Peter Maxwell Davis. Some of her later work on stone textures and patterns, the sense of scale is disrupted. It's difficult and ultimately not very important to tell whether it's 100 feet up. Many of Gunnie's walks were along the shoreline, she chose this space, the foreshore, to make a significant body of work in the 1980s, leading to the book Stone, made with George Mackay Brown. The shore is a magical zone, not always there, not quite land and not quite sea, neither, but both, with its gaps and fissures and portals of rock pools like we see here. Looking through the slides from the Stone body of work, you sometimes find that Moberg has returned to photograph the same stones in changing lights, catching their moods. And Fay Godwin's comment, if you remember, suggesting the garden would become the photographer's paradise, played out, and Gooney made some beautiful images of flora. Her playing with the surface of the photograph here and interacting with the photograph as an object in itself by placing petals on top of the photograph and re-photographing it to render it. Again, the technique is shown here in a more subtle way. Gooney worked as a photojournalist, sending films off to the papers south, and her ability to contain just enough of the narrative within the frame while still leaving some sense of the unexplained is demonstrated here. We'll also see that in Chalmers' work that we're about to look at now. Chalmers was born in Edinburgh and studied photography at the Polytechnic of Central London. He began teaching at Napier University, and that was in 1979, and he also taught in the late 90s at Stevenson College. He had Orkney links. His grandmother was a shearer, and his father was from a Kirkwall family of Chalmers. In the winter of 74 to 75, he spent 3 months photographing in Orkney, returning for a summer. And his book, Life in the Orkney Islands, was published in 1979. The sheep here are being brought in from their grazing in Copponsea for sale in Kirkwall. Stunning, stunning photograph. And just take a moment here to savor the wonderful shapes and echoes in this photograph. Look at the dance of the window washers and the musical notes of the lights in the windows. And you'll notice that even the A shape of the ladder is echoed in the solid A of the signage. This image of Madonna and Child is very beautiful. The title of this work is Fay and Son, Incomers to Sandy. I like the angles and movement in Chick's work. And here at a fiberglass hull making yard, you can feel the weight of the door. The image is economical, but very powerful. Keith Allardyce was born in the edge of a Northumberland coalfield, and he left home at the age of 18 to study photography in London. He worked there at Imperial College's physics department as their department photographer, but found himself drawn to an advert for a sub warden in Orkney, an RSPB warden, moving to take up the post in 74. His first book, At Scotland's Edge, drew on his 2 years as a lighthouse keeper at Salisbury. Later came Sea Haven, published in 92, and this was commissioned by the Stromness Community Council. Keith said, sometimes the book was photo-led, but generally it was story-led, so that the photographs accurately accompanied Bryce Wilson's chapters. I'm now working with the Keith Allardyce collection, digitising it for Stromness Museum, where Keith gifted his archive. And I get the sense of shifting through time while located in one space, in a sort of reversal of Sandy Wylie's shot of the revolving earth. It's almost for me as if the earth has stood still and time has shifted. This photograph, for example, is of the square where I live. And at the moment, being so immersed in scanning his work, as I walk the streets, I can see imprints of Keith's photographs everywhere. This is the artist Sylvia Wishart, whose home became part of the Peer Arts Centre. And she's photographed here by Allardyce for the Sea Haven book. Now another visiting photographer, Martin Parr. Martin Parr's been to Orkney several times. His wife, Susie Parr, is a keen sea swimmer and in fact wrote a book on the subject. Martin Parr's perhaps the best known photographer working in the UK at the moment. He is a Magnum photographer, another, and a celebrated photo book creator, as well as a collector of early and rare photo books. His work is often shown in a montage where colours and shapes connect across a grid-like presentation. And in his supersaturated world, colour is the main compositional tool. As a document of life in the British Isles, he is drawn to public events, openings, popular food culture, and cultural rituals. No wonder he was magnetically drawn then to Orkney's agricultural show week. And his work, Made in Orkney, is part of his body of work called Think of Scotland. I happened to be standing beside Martin Parr when he took this photograph of a blackening. That's a pre-wedding ritual that happens here. I took a photograph too, but I think this is better. Orkney was able to draw Parr in. There waiting for him on a Formica table at an industrial show was an eager and proud third prize tatty mouse. Now we move on to Pradip Malde. Prad was born in Tanzania in 1959 and he studied at GSA, then at Bournemouth. And Prad moved to Orkney in 81 and lived here until 1984, when he then went on to work with photographer Imogen Cunningham's archive. And he's currently teaching and working in communities in Haiti, Tanzania, and Tennessee, designing models for community development through photography. And his series about Boo Sands and Bury was made in 82, 83. The sands at Boo brought together for Prad two mediated experiences: the Apollo moon landings heard on the radio as a child at school in view of the Himalayas, and later seeing Harry Callahan's beach photographs from Cape Cod. Prad says of this, and I'm paraphrasing here, Prad, because I know you're in. Then one day, ambling along my favourite stretch of beach in Orkney, I felt a conflation of visual experiences and memories. The shadow of a lunar module strut, debossed in the sand dust, faint traces of human activity, whiteness that is without place, all powder and threatening imagination, a light so harsh that it is without shadow, it denies itself. And thanks, Prad, for letting me share your work tonight. And on to Robin, a friend of Prad's. Robin Gillanders was born in Edinburgh and he's lived there ever since. He was a reader in photography at Edinburgh Napier University and taught there for 30 years. And I was one of his students, as Matt mentioned earlier. And so was Ingrid Budge, that we'll look at later. And Robin visits Orkney frequently. He photographed Orkney, mainly Rousey and Wyre, the island's Rousey and Wyre, for his book Highland Journey in the Spirit of Edwin Muir. This was made in 2009, where he followed the route in Muir's 1934 book Scottish Journey. He followed the Highland part of that route. And Robin kitted out his camper van and set off, processing his large format sheet film on board the camper van. And the shower room was his dark room. And he scanned in the 5:4 negatives so he could view them while he was on the road. In the end, he spent 80 days on this trip across the Highlands and Islands, looking for, as Edwin Muir had put it, the Scotland which presents itself to one who is not looking for anything in particular and is willing to believe what his eyes and ears tell him. In this photograph, we see Edwin Muir's Eden, the Boo, his childhood home in Wyre. Now, Ingrid Budge. Ingrid was born in Kirkwall, and Ingrid operates across digital and traditional photography with a leaning towards film and pinhole photography. She works in lumen, cyanotype, wet plate, and chemigram processes, and here she's working with an iPhone in this image. Yesnaby, where this photograph is taken, is a place Ingrid regularly makes work about. Ingrid likes using different film stock, often out of date film stock, And here she is on a SLR camera, Nikon, with Kodak Portra film, sorry. In her most recent work, Ingrid has chosen chemigrams as the language to speak about the places she missed during recent restrictions that we've all been under. And in case you don't know the chemigram process, it's a cameraless technique that exploits the reactions of fix and developer on photographic paper, and resists can be used to manipulate this effect. The work can be done in the light, and in Ingrid's case, she often makes her chemigrams in the landscape, where the weather and the air and the ground can become part of that process. In a series, Alchemical Journey, recently shown at the Peer Arts Centre, in fact, it just finished last week. It was wonderful to be absorbed in a whole room of her work. The scale is often small, and it's almost like these are postcards from places. Ingrid uses different chemistry, dilutions, and paper stock to achieve travel in the mind. Raymond Beasant. He was also born in Kirkwall and studied applied bioscience in Aberdeen. And he started photography as a means of getting photographs of birds he was looking at. And at school, he was using an old Russian Zenit camera, and he was able to use the darkroom there. And the story, the background of the story of many photographers is like that. And certainly that's my own story, starting at school with an encouraging art teacher and access to a darkroom. During the holidays from uni, Raymond worked at the photo lab in Sutherlands in Kirkwall and learnt about colour printing. He'd started as a freelance photographer in Aberdeen, and soon he graduated and later got a job at the P&J as their press photographer. And it was while he was at the P&J that Raymond started filming wildlife, and he is now a very much celebrated wildlife cameraman. Guiliette Verdon Roe studied at the International Centre for Photography in New York, and she worked as photo editor at the Village Voice newspaper, and then worked as a black and white printer to the master printer, Teresa Engel Marino, working with negatives by photographers such as Robert Capa. And in 2008, Guiliette came to North Romsey to work on a series called As You Are, about the islanders. She returned a couple of years later, showing these large-scale portraits. They were immense, they were huge, and she showed them at the manse in North Romsey. And as a conversation across time, there's a pretty good conversation going on between Guiliette and Dr. Garvie, who was a doctor in North Romsey in the 1930s. Dr. Beatrice Garvie's collection of photographs of North Romsey and the Islanders is held at the Orkney Library and Archive. And it can also be seen at the archives in North Romsey. And her work is currently being explored by the artist Fiona Sanderson. Now to Frances. Frances Scott is from Orkney and currently based in Glasgow. She graduated from the Glasgow School of Art in 2014, and her work often focuses on journeys made through a landscape of personal significance. And for a number of years now, she has been walking and documenting the coastlines of Orkney. Frances has been tracing the limits of the island, physically imprinting on the coastline itself, making maps of the shape of the walks using GPS. Frances records the walk using photography and memory, distilling the experience into a few words like a memo of something that stood out for her. And these can be very detailed maps that she writes. There's a combination of the writing and the mapping and the photography. And she's been exhibiting these maps and texts alongside the photographs. She has completed the coastline of mainland Orkney impressively, and is now moving on to walking around the Isles. Interestingly, both Gunnie and Frances have worked for Loganair, flying over the islands. And Frances seems to walk to reconnect, to be grounded and to belong. Frances writes about something said by Gunnie Moberg, who described the ancient structures of Orkney as pieces of jewellery far below when she was doing her aerial work. Frances writes of this, her wording clarified something about my project. Jewellery is usually small, personal, and can be collected and treasured. These walks are my way of collecting Orkney piece by piece, my route map shrinking the experience of each journey into something small and intricate that can be kept forever and carried and worn close. And now the last of our featured photographers tonight. This is Sarah Wylie. Sarah graduated last year, sadly unable to have a public degree show, which was a shame because she had the most beautiful show. And like Frances Scott and Gunnie Moberg, walking is an intrinsic part of Sarah's practice. She discusses the camera as an extension of her body. Her work is analogue, and she finds the slower process of working in film allows her time for reflection. Sarah feels that by the act of photographing, she is staging the landscape, and the immenseness of Orkney is present in her photographs, but she resists making the location itself a feature, preferring, as she says, transitional landscapes, landscapes that don't pin themselves down to a specific location. Despite not being specific, they are thoroughly Orkney, and like Frances and Gunnie and Ingrid Budge, the coastline, the space between land and sea, is significant for Sarah. It's a liminal zone, it's about the edges. For me, an island is defined more by the sea than the land. And so the part where one gives way to another is a very magical, special place. So here we are, around 140 years after the first photograph we looked at tonight. And the final short section of tonight's talk is going to be a collection of conversations between photographs over the years. While preparing this talk, I came across photographs that agreed with each other or commented on each other or shared a joke or shared a subject, compositional element or a colour. So in this last section, we're going to take a few minutes to look at a selection of pairings which will be shown individually, first one then the other. And this one will not be commented on. We can look together in silence, almost like an exhibition, if only a momentary one, just for here and now. Thank you very much.
Hi, Rebecca. Thank you. That was wonderful.
Great. I'm just trying to stop my share now. I can't see my mouse. There we go.
Hey, excellent. That's the business. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thank you. We have a couple of questions. I have there's a new message, couple of new messages at the bottom. Other people just saying thank you to you. Fantastic presentation. If you open the chat, you'll be able to see these as well. And previous questions were an interesting one about drone photography and whether the way in which, I suppose, photographers from the 1980s and 1990s only had access to the air through aircraft. But now with the ubiquitous drone photograph, it's really quite a different thing. What do you think these photographers like Gunnie Moberg would make of drone photography?
Well, it's difficult to say, isn't it? I mean, when she was doing that work, it was so different. People had not seen Orkney that way at all before. It was a totally different way of looking at the place. And as she said, talking about that, knocking out that dimension, which is maybe something, I don't know, a lot of the drone photography, I don't know if that's, I suppose we could think of an angle, whether it's a bird's eye view or whether it's an oblique view, you know, does it mimic the sort of early aerial photographs that were in air balloons, maybe more than aircraft?
Oh, yeah. That is interesting. Yes, I do like that idea of the kind of the air balloon photographs. Yes, the focus
more of an oblique view, isn't it? You know,
yeah.
It's more of a view like that. Yeah.
The focus on the coast was something that resonated a great deal in all the photographers. Yes. And you mentioned that the coast is a transition space, and I wondered whether the aerial photographs of Gunnie Moberg, particularly that one of it was a diagonal, it was a breakwater with a road going across it.
Yes, that's one of the Churchill barriers.
One of the Churchill barriers, yeah. I mean, that really showed the tension between land and sea. It showed that space. And I wonder whether drone photography in the future will be able to reveal more about these transitional spaces than we can do having to stand on land.
Yeah, and when we talk about them being transitional spaces, Gunnie Moberg's, you know, they are actually just disappearing. And a lot of Moberg's work is interesting to look at now when we look at the disappearing coastline, changing coastline. Mm-hmm. And when you talk about drone photographs, there was some drone photography by Colin Keldy done recently just for the Science Festival, and of a particular coastline in Marwick, and just the other week a whole pile of that just came down. It's not there anymore. So when we talk about transitional, it's transitional in a psychological way, but it's also physically just shifting and changing. And those Churchill barriers, they've changed hugely. So one of them is just entirely filled up with sand. In fact, Boo, where Prad was showing the work from, or rather where I was showing Prad's work from, Boo's just along from Barrier 4, and that's a totally shifting space. I mean, that changes all the time. In the intervening few years since the barriers were put up post-war, it's been completely taken over with sand. The marram grass has held it like a net. Yeah, so it's constantly changing, even though we think it's stable and it's going to be there forever. It isn't. It's always moving and constantly changing. And Francis Scott has just popped into the chat box that Frank McElhinney writes about aerial photography, and Frank has actually produced work from kites and was speaking at the Stirling Photography Festival last week and is speaking with us in a fortnight. And I believe Frank is here tonight as well. But someone was also asking whether Gunnie Moberg in particular worked with pilots who could inform her about the landscape. So was it an interaction between Gunnie Moberg and the pilot that helped her to create the images, or was it self-directed? It was very much with a particular pilot called Andy Alsop, who ran the Islander plane, and Gunnie would go in the co-pilot seat with him and hang out the window, which Francis will be able to keep us right on Loganair protocol these days, but I'm pretty sure you're not allowed to do that anymore. But she used to hang out that. And interestingly, when I was looking through her archive and through the negatives in particular from that series, from that mid-70s series, there's nothing else around the frame. There'll just be one or two shots. It's not shot after shot, and it's not cropped afterwards. It's all made in the camera. extremely definite compositions are made in camera while hanging out of a plane. It's very impressive.
And
But
Frank's
yeah, so
just
it
popped
was,
something. Frank's just popped into the chat box that kite photography predates aeroplanes. So there we are. And Pradip Malde has asked the question about I'm just trying to find it here. Yes, you've absorbed so many people's work over the years. This must have influenced your own work. Would you be able to talk about the particular nature of influence all this has had on you?
that's so hard to say, isn't it? Thanks, Prad. That's very, very difficult to think about because I'm just looking at the stuff all the time, particularly you looking at the work in the archives. But I think it really has had an impression on me. I think kind of in terms of Gooney's work, the slowing down of things and the intense looking at everything, trying to take things in, quite a slow approach to taking in the natural environment has had an effect. And at the moment, I'm working on a project looking at grasses, and that's all about slowing down and noticing the seasons and noticing small changes. So that I would certainly say they've been influenced from Gunnie Moberg's work. And also, I find myself kind of thinking about photographs that I've seen and going back to the same places. And sometimes you never really know until much later how those photographs, you've absorbed them and they've ended up kind of coming out through your work. And sometimes you can be a little bit surprised and shocked when you look back and think, oh my goodness, that composition was all about this picture by this person. Yeah, I must say I do like a lot of the work that's held in the Orkney Library and Archive is so astounding, you know. I think one thing I would like to do is more portraiture. I haven't really done a lot of portraiture for many years, and a lot of the photographs I really like from the archive. We just saw a little glimpse of Beatrice Garvie's work there, but there's some beautiful work that she's done of portraits in North Ronaldsay and Keith Allardyce's portraits.
I was just going to mention Keith Allardyce there because I'm not overly familiar with the work and you've introduced me to it, but I haven't seen that much of it. But I really enjoyed the way in which his photographs were engaging directly with the sitter, the person in the photograph, and the gaze was directly back into the camera. And you know, that's unusual in the earlier photographs, but the images you presented did have that as well in it. So the fact that Keith Allardyce's direct gaze was actually in some of these earlier photographs, I find quite astonishing. That archive must really have influenced you then.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and Keith Allardyce's work, kind of working with that, it's just I make a lot of my work in Stromness, and just it is like I mentioned about kind of just walking through these photographs, and very little's changed. And when you go through the book, every time I go through the book, I always see someone else, and I think, oh, that's that person, and I hadn't realised. And so there's this constant kind of generosity of those sort of archives where you're just get given a little something each time you spend some time with it.
Yeah, the Keith Allardyce archive has generated more comments on the FLOW Photofest Facebook page than anything else. People commenting on their grannies and their grandfathers and things like that. It's been brilliant.
That photograph that I showed, the first one of Keith Allardyce's, is of Willick Sinclair, and he's a fisherman here. And I photograph his boat a lot. It's the most handsome boat in Stromness, and I think he's the most handsome man in Stromness. So Keith and I agreed on that, I think.
Another photographer that I'd like to see much more of was Sandy Wylie. The two photographs I wrote down here were the ones of the person feeding the seagulls or fighting the seagulls off, perhaps. And the other one was the trapeze artists.
Yes.
That was fascinating structure in both of these images. Yes, and it's interesting because the trapeze artist one, I'm thinking must have been taken at the Doonby show, one of the agricultural shows, which have turned up, through, the stack building competition, this idea of agricultural shows, and through Martin Parr's work. So there's these themes that run through work in Orkney. And I think that was probably taken at the Doonby show. And it's just the quietness of that photograph, when actually if the camera was tilted down, you would see a mass of people and a whole lot of cattle and sheep and horses. So it's amazing, it's very simplified, and lovely use of negative space in that picture. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. The visual elements are small, and you know, the space around it is huge. It really emphasises the danger and the kind of thrill element that's there. But Marge Bradshaw has asked a question. Apart from yourself, Rebecca, she says, who do you think are the up and coming young photographers working in Orkney that might be featuring in this kind of talk in 10, 20, 30 years' time? So who do you think are the ones to watch?
Well, I can't say that. I teach at the college. Possibly say that. But I have included in this talk Sarah Wylie, who's made some beautiful work that we just saw at the end there, who just graduated. Really enjoy her work. There's a lot of artists working in Orkney. It wouldn't be fair to think of any in particular, because that's maybe the other thing that's probably doesn't come across in this, is that in Orkney, there's so many artists working, and there's so many writers, and it's a very kind of open place of cultural exchange. So you might find that there'll be artists who work in print. For instance, Diana Leslie, I work a lot alongside her and really enjoy her work. So you might be influenced by people who are not necessarily photographers. Also archaeologists, they're very, they have influence on my work, and certainly on the work of photographers here. So that wasn't really an answer to Marge's question. I was just trying to fudge my way out of
You're
that.
avoiding it nicely, yes, indeed.
Yeah, but I'd like to think that in the future, there's so many women as well, isn't there, that have been featured in this talk, as we went through it in time. So I'd like to think there'd be a lot of these women's work would be shown, held in the archive for future use as well. I think the archive is an amazing place. I think it's an amazing place for photographers to be holding their work as well. The way that it can be accessed by different people.
And Francis Scott has popped into the chat box that Sarah Wylie's work is currently on display at Papa Westray at the Kelp store as part of the Moti Collective exhibition. So if anybody's able to get to Papa Westray, they'll be able to see more of Sarah Wylie's work there. And commenting, or I suppose acknowledging your comments there on the archive, Pradeep Malde has come in to say that in retrospect, he feels that working with archives may have been the biggest part of his education as a photographer. So I think that's a very valuable point, that the archives are not simply passive places, but they're actually, it's an active interaction between the person looking and the image that's been made. And as a photographer, it informs us and helps us move. Yeah.
Yes, and these people's work is alive. It's been talked about. It's been looked at and talked about.
And Marge is forgiving you. She says it was a fair response to her question. There we are. Well, there's a few things coming in. And Frank McElhenney's commenting on the most interesting photographs at the archive in Orkney Library are from World War II. And he's asking if there are any photographers you're aware of who are focused on Orkney's military significance.
There's a lot of work at the moment about the remaining war buildings, and there's something that I enjoy photographing. In fact, I did an exhibition with my mother, and she painted the landscapes, the views from the war buildings that dot the coastline, and I photographed the buildings. But there's been quite a lot of interesting work done around those recently. World War II, I need to think about that. I need to defer to David Mackey's the one to talk to. In fact, David's just left. He's retired. I shouldn't say that. He's gone. Lucy
Orkney was unique in having a photographic archivist. And, so
he's a senior archivist. So there's someone who works there, Colin works there, and what they do is they re-photograph everything, because that's a stable way of recording photographs, because we know that negatives last for hundreds of years. So there's a dark room in at the archives, and Colin photographs everything, so he works in that. Lucy Gibbons working there, and there's a new senior archivist about to start in post. But yes, there is a lot of World War II stuff. I should be able to think of that, but it's just gone from me right now.
Yeah, I did some research in Orkney a long time ago, and it was the gentleman you mentioned there, and it was fantastic being able to speak to someone who understood photography and what I was interested in. So it really is a unique setting that you've got there. I.J. Henderson has asked if you had not moved to Orkney, would your personal work have moved in a significantly different direction, do you think?
There's a question to ponder. I mean, I feel for myself like, you know, but certainly when Gunnie moved to Orkney, she just completely exploded in her photography, and she was doing a lot of different sort of medium before that. But photography became her main language when she got here. And it's not that I've been working in different mediums, but I do feel that my photography has changed since I've got here, possibly. I think it's a lot more focused on the natural world. Seaweed is a big thing that I make work about, and I certainly hadn't been doing that when I lived in Fife. But maybe I should have been. But while I was in Fife, I was interested in clouds, and that's something that I still am interested in. So I suppose that's one thing that's continued on. But I think that first year when I worked here at the Peat Art Centre residency in art and agriculture kind of really set the tone for what was going to come. It's just a very kind of agricultural, land-based, sea-based sort of approach that I've been taking. So yes, I'm sure it's taken a different direction.
Well, that's us reached 22, and there's one more question coming in. Any more work being done in the cave? Well, I'm not aware of this, but is there any more work being done in the cave where a skull was found? Also around images of a dig. Are you aware of that, Rebecca?
No.
No, I'm not. I'm not sure.
Kind of beyond anything now.
Yeah.
There's a lot of amazing archaeology going on. Was that the Iron Age one? Cameron, was that Iron Age? There was something recently. Yes, and unfortunately, a lot of my friends are archaeologists, and Antonia Thomas, who lives across the way, she does some really interesting photography of markings in Neolithic structures, developed a technique to really bring out the incisions. It's quite interesting. She's been doing, and I work a lot with Mark Edmonds, who's an author and an archaeologist, and spent a year and a half with him going around sites and working the landscape. Ask them.
Well, I have Cameron's information. Cameron and I have emailed each other a few times. So if you find anything out, you can let me know.
You're back.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yep, got you
Hi
now.
there. Yes, I'm back. I just seem to be kicked out, then kicked back in again. Yes, Cameron and I can email each other about that, and we can pass information across. But that's us reached nearly 1:45, so I think we should draw it to a close and say thank you very much to Rebecca Marr for her fabulous presentation and the breadth of photography that was presented tonight. We'll hopefully get this up on YouTube soon so that people can browse back through it. There's been a number of comments saying that they're glad it's being recorded because there was so much to take in. So thank you very, very much indeed. And yeah, Frances is just saying she's delighted it will be accessible afterwards. So good night, everybody. And I hope that those of you who are able to in the Highlands and Islands can see some of the FLOW Photofest exhibitions over the next 2 to 3 weeks. Take care. Good night.
Thank you.